Dear students and viewers, hello and welcome to this Tele Class. My name is Altaf Hussain and I am working as a lecturer in the discipline of Environmental Science at Government Girls Higher Secondary School, Maga. Now dear students, before getting started, I urge all of you to follow all the COVID guidelines and SOPs. Regularly wash your hands, put on the mask and wash your hands regularly so that we can stop the spread of this coronavirus or at least minimize its transmission. Now dear student, जैसा कि आपको पता ही है, हम जो हमारा पिछला टॉपिक था, जो हमारा पिछला लेक्चर था इनफैक्ट, उसमें हमने एडेप्टेशंस को डिस्कस किया हुआ था. एडेप्टेशंस की डेफिनेशन हमने उसमें देखी और आज का ये जो हमारा टॉपिक है, हमारा टेली क्लास है, हमारा लेक्चर है, इसमें हम डिस्कस करेंगे द टाइप्स ऑफ एडेप्टेशंस और साथ ही साथ हम इसमें ये भी डिस्कस करेंगे दैट व्हाट आर द एडेप्टेशंस टू टेम्परेचर स्पेशली in plants. Now before getting started, before discussing the types of adaptations, for the benefit of those students जिन्होंने पिछली क्लास मिस की होगी या just for the sake of a quick recap, let's first of all understand what are adaptations. Now जैसा कि मैंने last time भी आपको बोला था, adaptations हम बेसिकली बोलते हैं these are the specific or special traits or attributes or features जो एक ऑर्गेनिज्म में डेवलप हुए हैं ओवर अ लॉन्ग पीरियड ऑफ टाइम. और ये जो एडेप्टेशंस है, इन फीचर्स की वजह से, इन ट्रेट्स की वजह से, ये जो ऑर्गेनिजम्स हैं they have enhanced their chances of survival. So we can say adaptations are simply they are the traits or adaptations are the features. Adaptations are the traits or adaptations are the features of an organism which allow it or which enhances its number one chances of survival, chances of survival. इतना ही नहीं, chances of survival ही नहीं, it makes the organisms more fit as compared to the other organisms of its own species. So दूसरा, it makes the organisms more fit, isn't it? It makes the organisms more fit as compared to the other members of its own species. ये दूसरा point है. And the third one which is very important, ये जो adaptations होती है, ये एक organisms को permit करती है. Now these adaptations, they permit an organisms to exist under the conditions of its habitat. So adaptations permit the organisms. Now these adaptations, they permit the organisms to exist within its habitat और उसके साथ साथ जो भी उस habitat की conditions होगी. By conditions of the habitat we mean the temperature, the prevailing wind conditions, the light intensity, the moisture, humidity. All these features, they are referred to as the habitat conditions. So adaptations are the traits, features which enhance the chances of survival, which makes the organisms more fit as compared to its own as compared to the other members of its own species, and it permits an organisms to exist under the certain habitat conditions. या उस habitat की जो conditions होती है उसमें वो कैसे अपने आप को survive करता है, ठीक है ना, उसमें वो कैसे dwell करता है, उसमें वो कैसे survive करता है, ठीक है. तो उन traits और features को हम क्या बोलते हैं? Adaptations. Now the question is, ये जो फीचर्स होते हैं ये कैसे डेवलप होंगे एक ऑर्गेनिज्म में? नाउ दीज फीचर्स आर एक्वायर्ड इन एन ऑर्गेनिज्म्स. दीज फीचर्स आर एक्वायर्ड इन एन ऑर्गेनिज्म जब उस ऑर्गेनिज्म में कुछ मॉर्फोलॉजिकल चेंजेस आएंगी, उस ऑर्गेनिज्म में कुछ फिजियोलॉजिकल चेंजेस आएंगी या उस ऑर्गेनिज्म में कुछ बिहेवियरल चेंजेस आएंगी, तब जाके उसके जो चांसेस होते हैं सर्वाइवल के, या वो उस इकोसिस्टम में या वो उस एनवायरनमेंट में सर्वाइव कर सकता है. सो वी कैन से ये जितने भी हमने यहाँ पे फीचर्स देखें जिसकी वजह से इसका सर्वाइवल इंक्रीज होता है, तो ये कैसे होंगी? जब मॉर्फोलॉजिकल चेंजेस आएंगी, मॉर्फोलॉजिकल चेंजेस मींस स्ट्रक्चरल चेंजेस। जब फिजियोलॉजिकल चेंजेस आएंगी, फिजियोलॉजिकल चेंजेस मींस the functional changes and the behavioral changes which are developed in an organism. तो हम adaptations को in terms of these changes कैसे define करेंगे अब? So let's go to the basic definition of adaptations. So we can say adaptations are basically useful morphological adaptations are useful morphological, जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला morphological that means structural, morphological और structural, physiological या जिनको हम functional भी बोलते हैं, और functional and behavioral changes. These are functional, structural or behavioral changes which are developed in an organisms over a long period of time. ये जो changes हुई हैं और ये जो changes है ये एक organism में develop होती है, and these changes are developed over a long period of time so as to adjust itself to a particular set of environmental conditions, or so as to adjust itself to a particular environment. So we can say adaptations, they are useful structural, useful functional and behavioral changes which are developed in an organism over a very long period of time, जिन changes की वजह से ये जो इसमें develop होती है over long period of time, इससे इन चेंजेस की वजह से एक ऑर्गेनिज्म का सर्वाइवल चांसेस बढ़ जाते हैं एंड इट कैन लिव, इट कैन ड्वेल इन अ पर्टिकुलर एनवायरनमेंट. सो जितने भी ये चेंजेस है, इन चेंजेस की वजह से क्या होता है, ये एडजस्ट कर पाता है एक पर्टिकुलर ऑर्गेनिज्म, इट एडजस्ट्स इटसेल्फ इन अ पर्टिकुलर एनवायरनमेंट, इन अ पर्टिकुलर environment. Now let's discuss these. Now what are these structural changes, what are these functional changes, what are these behavioral changes, थोड़ा बहुत इनके बारे में पढ़ेंगे. So as we have just defined that adaptations, basically these adaptations, they are the structural changes, they are the functional changes, and not only that, these adaptations, they are the behavioral changes, जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, which are developed in an organisms over a long period of time. Now what do we mean by these structural changes? What do we mean by these structural changes? What do we mean by these structural changes? Now these structural changes are basically, they are the modifications in structure. We can say that these structural changes are modifications. These are the modifications in the structure. इसीलिए तो हम इनको morphological या structural changes बोलते हैं. These are the modifications in the structure and design of an organism. In the design of an organism. Modifications in the structure and design of an organism. और ये जो structural changes होती है, these structural changes are quite evident. ये बिल्कुल आया होती है, बिल्कुल visible होती है. These changes are these are completely discernible. जो हम इनकी appearance से हमें पता चलता है that these are the adaptations which they have developed over a long period of time. So we say modifications, these structural changes, these are the modifications in structure, these are the modifications in the design of an organism, in the design of an organisms. और जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, these structural changes, they are quite evident from their appearance, quite evident. These structural changes, they are quite evident from their appearance. इनकी मैं अगर आपको एक example दे दूं, we have certain marine animals, seals हम जिनको बोलते हैं, seals, these are the marine animals. Now these seals have developed flippers. Now what do they use these flippers for? They use these flippers for, these flippers are used for navigation. They are used for navigation, these flippers. Now these flippers are basically the structural changes which have been developed in these seals just for navigating through the oceanic waters or marine waters. So this is a classical example of the structural changes. Now let's discuss about the functional changes. What do we mean by these functional changes? Now functional changes, basically these functional changes, these are the functional changes, these are the specialities in body chemistry and the metabolic activities. These functional changes, जिनको हम physiological changes भी बोलते हैं, functional changes, basically these functional changes, they are the specialities, these are the specialities, these physiological changes or the functional changes, these are the specialities in the body chemistry, isn't it? These functional changes, जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, these are the specialities in body chemistry and not only that, the metabolic activities. Metabolic activities, तभी तो हम इनको physiological changes बोलेंगे और functional changes, because they involve the metabolic activities, they involve the body chemistry, isn't it? इसमें कुछ changes होती है within the body, तब जाके हम इनको functional changes बोलते हैं, because they involve the various body functions, isn't it? अब ये changes क्यों होती है? In order to adjust, in order to enable them to adjust in a particular environment or to fit in a given environmental setup. So हम ये कह सकते हैं, these are simply the internal adjustments. These are the internal adjustments. ठीक है? We can say these are the specialities in body chemistry and metabolic activities, or we can say these are the internal adjustments, so that ये इस काबिल हो जाते हैं organisms ताकि ये एक particular environment में thrive कर सके. ठीक है? अब अगर मैं इसकी एग्जांपल आपको दे दूं, स्ट्रक्चरल चेंजेस में हमने बात की सील्स के बारे में, तो फंक्शनल चेंजेस में अगर हम देखेंगे, नो देयर आर सर्टेन प्लांट्स, द लीव्स ऑफ व्हिच प्रोड्यूस सर्टेन टॉक्सिन्स इन ऑर्डर टू रिपेल द हर्बिवोर्स, दिस इज वन एग्जांपल. अगर मैं इसकी एक एग्जांपल दे दूं, वी कैन से दैट द लीव्स ऑफ सर्टेन प्लांट्स, the leaves of certain plants, now what do? They produce certain toxins, isn't it? Now toxins are the poisonous substances, they are very harmful metabolites, and these toxins, they repel the herbivores, Now we have one more example of these physiological changes. We have now certain desert animals, for example kangaroo rats, they have specialized kidneys, they have very efficient kidneys, and those kidneys are a very good example of, another example of these functional changes. Presence of efficient kidneys, in certain desert animals, और उन animals की examples में the best example is kangaroo rats. So these were the two examples of physiological changes. The first one was the production of toxins by the leaves of certain plants in order to repel the herbivores. The second example is the presence of efficient kidneys in certain desert animals like kangaroo rats. Now the third one is behavioral changes. What do we mean by behavioral changes? Behavioral changes का मतलब ये है कि कोई पर्टिकुलर ऑर्गेनिज्म कैसे रिएक्ट करता है बाय इट्स एक्टिविटीज टू द चेंजिंग एनवायरनमेंट. ठीक है, सो वी हैव द थर्ड वन, दैट इज बिहेवियरल चेंजेस. बिहेवियरल चेंजेस, जैसा कि मैंने अभी आपको बोला, व्हाट डू वी मीन बाय बिहेवियरल चेंजेस? बाय बिहेवियरल चेंजेस वी मीन दैट हाउ एन ऑर्गेनिज्म एक्ट्स और हाउ एन ऑर्गेनिज्म रिएक्ट्स by its activities towards a given set of environmental conditions. So we can write behavioral changes we mean how an organism acts or how it reacts by its activities towards a given set of environmental conditions, towards a given set or changing environmental conditions, towards a given set of environmental conditions. इसकी जो अगर हम एग्जाम्पल देखेंगे, now the bird migration, the migration of birds from warmer areas, from colder regions to warmer areas, when the environment becomes tough, when the environment is not favorable for the survival, for growth, for reproduction, isn't it? So उस सूरत में क्या होता है, the birds they show some changes by way of changing their behavior. They move, they migrate from the regions of from colder regions to warmer areas, from colder regions to warmer areas, to warmer areas. So bird migration is a classical example of the behavioral changes in organisms. Now what is the need of these adaptations? Though we have discussed during the past few minutes or during the course of the lecture so far, we have discussed it, कि behavioral changes, these adaptations, they are very important. First of all, what is the need of these adaptations? I will write it here. What is the need? What is the need of these adaptations? The first one is, you should remember, dear students, that it helps an organism to adapt to its environment in order to increase the chances of its survival. पहला क्या है? First one is to adjust or adapt. किस लिए? ताकि इसकी जो सर्वाइवल चांसेस है वो इंक्रीज हो जाए. अब ये सर्वाइवल चांसेस कैसे इंक्रीज हो जाएंगे एडेप्टेशन से? जब एक पर्टिकुलर ऑर्गेनिज्म कूप करेगा विथ डिफरेंट फिजिकल कंडीशंस, लाइक टेम्परेचर, like light, changing light intensity, fluctuating temperatures, etc. ठीक है. The second one, adaptations help in the continuation of race. How? By reproduction, by rearing of offsprings. So we can say adaptations, they help in the continuation of race. The continuation of race. ठीक है. By कैसे? जैसा कि मैंने अभी बोला, by reproduction, by rearing of offsprings. And very important point, adaptations play a very important role. They are in fact a basic cause of shabash, they are a basic cause of evolution. Adaptations are a basic cause of, they are a basic cause of evolution. Very important. So these were few of the needs of adaptations. Now let's discuss about the different types of adaptations. Or in fact, we will be discussing the long-term and short-term adaptations in this class. Types of adaptation. Types of adaptation. What are the different types of adaptations? You should remember that the adaptations are basically of two types: the short-term adaptations and long-term adaptations. So we have short term adaptations and we have long term adaptations. Now what are the short term and long term adaptations? Let's discuss them one by one. जैसा कि नाम से ही पता चलता है, short term adaptations are basically temporary physiological changes which are developed in an organism in a response to temporary environmental changes, right? So short term adaptations, इनका जो पहला फीचर है that they are temporary changes. They are temporary changes. कौन सी changes? Let's say physiological changes. Temporary physiological changes which are developed in an organism in response to temporary environmental changes. In response to temporary environmental changes. So short term adaptations are basically temporary physiological changes which are developed in an organism in response to temporary environmental changes. This is the first point, very important. Now the second one, these adaptations, they are non-inheritable. They do not get inherited, right? So this is very important. We will discuss about an example जिससे आपको ये clear हो जाएगा. Last में मैं आपको इसी example लेके बताऊंगा. Now these are non-inheritable. They do not get inherited. These adaptations don't get passed from parents to their offsprings. That's why we call them that non-inheritable. They do not get inherited. The third one, different organisms जो होते हैं, एक ही species के जो different organisms होंगे, उनमें different tendency होगी, उनमें different adaptations होंगी, उनमें different degrees of adaptations होंगी. ये short term adaptations. So we can say different organisms, different members of the same species show different degrees of adaptations, these short term adaptations. So we can say different members same species की, this is very important, different members of the same species, they show different degrees of adaptations. They show different degrees of adaptations. They show different degrees of adaptations. Now the fourth one, which is very important, the fourth one, this is important, you should remember this, that DNA is not changed. In adaptations में DNA change नहीं होता है. DNA is not changed. And when the DNA is not changed, we can say that these adaptations, they do not play any role in evolution. You should remember this, that the DNA, in case of short term adaptations, the DNA is not changed. So we can say these adaptations, they play no role in evolution. So we can say these play no role in evolution. Now let's take an example. The example of tanning of skin. Tanning of skin, जिसको हम सन टैन भी बोलते हैं. आपने नोटिस किया होगा, whenever we have the prolonged exposure to sunlight, जब भी हम सन में, ओपन सन में काम करते हैं बहुत देर तक, तो हमारी जो स्किन है, it gets dark, जिसको हम टैनिंग बोलते हैं. Now why does the skin gets dark? It is because of the accumulation of the pigment which is found in the skin, that is melanin. The melanin gets deposited in the upper layers of the skin, और उससे क्या होता है, जो हमारी underlying जो layers होते हैं, they get protected from the harmful radiations. And when we discontinue the exposure, to sunlight, ये जो sun tan है, it gets reversed. So we can say the tanning of skin, the darkening of the skin on the prolonged exposure to the sunlight, उसको हम बोलेंगे it's a short term adaptation because it gets reversed, isn't it? It's a physiological change. इसमें DNA change नहीं होगा, ये inherit नहीं होगा, तो इसलिए हम इसको बोलते हैं it is a short term adaptations. अब हम बात करेंगे long term adaptation की. अब हम बात करेंगे लॉन्ग टर्म एडेप्टेशन की. देखो नाम से ही ये पता चलता है इट्स अ लॉन्ग टर्म एडेप्टेशन. अगर ये लॉन्ग टर्म एडेप्टेशन है दैट मीन्स इट इज अ परमानेंट चेंज, राइट? सो वी कैन से द फर्स्ट पॉइंट, लॉन्ग टर्म एडेप्टेशंस आर, फर्स्ट वन, यूजफुल, these are the useful permanent changes, right? We can say these are the useful permanent biological changes. These are the useful permanent biological changes which are developed in an organism in response to permanent environmental changes, not temporary but permanent environmental changes. यहाँ पे याद रख, बहुत ही important है, यहाँ पे याद रखने की जरूरत है that these are the useful permanent biological changes in response to permanent environmental changes. Permanent environmental changes. The second point which is very important, that they are inheritable. These changes, these adaptations, they get passed on from one generation to another generations. So these changes are inheritable. These changes are inheritable. अब ये जो लॉन्ग टर्म एडेप्टेशंस होती है, यहां पे क्या होता है, ऑल द मेंबर्स ऑफ द सेम स्पीशीज, आई रिपीट, ऑल द मेंबर्स ऑफ द सेम स्पीशीज शो द सेम एडेप्टेशंस. सो द थर्ड पॉइंट इज all the members of same species, these members, they display same adaptations. अब शॉर्ट टर्म में हमने क्या देखा, शॉर्ट टर्म में हमने ये देखा कि ये जो डिफरेंट मेंबर्स होते हैं सेम स्पीशीज के, दे में शो डिफरेंट डिग्री ऑफ एडेप्टेशंस. लेकिन यहां पे क्या होता है, ऑल द मेंबर्स, सभी मेंबर्स जो होते हैं स्पीशीज के, सभी ऑर्गेनिजम्स, इनमें सेम एडेप्टेशंस होती है, और यही एडेप्टेशंस, यही चेंजेस बाद में एक जनरेशन से लेके दूसरी जनरेशन को पास ऑन हो जाते हैं. वहां पे हमने देखा शॉर्ट टर्म एडेप्टेशंस में दैट डीएनए इज नॉट चेंज्ड, बट हियर the DNA is changed. Hence, we say that these adaptations play a very important role in the process of evolution. So we can say DNA is changed. DNA is changed. And when the DNA is changed, we can say that these adaptations, they play a very important role in evolution. Important role in evolution. Important role in evolution. So long term adaptations में हमने क्या देखा, long term adaptations में हमने ये देखा that these are useful permanent biological changes which are developed in an organism in response to permanent environmental changes. This is point number 1. इसको अगर हम कंपेयर करें शॉर्ट टर्म एडेप्टेशंस के साथ, वहां पे टेम्परेरी चेंजेस आती है ऑर्गेनिजम्स की बॉडी में. Short term are temporary changes in response to temporary environmental changes like the suntan, melanin accumulation in the skin, isn't it, tanning of the skin. और ये जो long term adaptations होती है, these adaptations are inheritable. What do we mean by inheritable? That these adaptations, they get transferred from the parents to their offsprings. And वहां पे short term adaptations में they are non-inheritable. The third point, all the members of the same species, they show the same adaptations, isn't it? तो short term adaptation में हमने क्या देखा, different members of same species show different degrees of adaptations. And the last point very important. Short term adaptations में हमने देखा that DNA is not changed, hence the short term adaptations play no role in the process of evolution. और यहाँ पे long term adaptations में हमने देखा that DNA is changed and these adaptations, these long term adaptations, they play a very important role in the process of evolution. अब इसकी अगर हम example लिख दें long term adaptations की, long term adaptations की अगर हम एग्जांपल दें, we can say the structure of beaks and claws, the structure and beaks and claws of certain birds, they are well suited to their perching and feeding habits, isn't it? इन्होंने ओवर अ वेरी लॉन्ग पीरियड ऑफ टाइम इनकी बीक्स जो होती है, इनके क्लॉज जो होते हैं, वो इस तरह से मॉडिफाई हुए हैं ताकि उनके जो पर्चिंग हैबिट्स है, उनके जो फीडिंग हैबिट्स है, उनको वो सूट कर सके. A very good example of long term adaptation is that the structure of beaks and claws, and इनमें ऐसी चेंजेस आई है ताकि उनकी जो पर्चिंग फीड हैबिट्स है या फीडिंग हैबिट्स है, उन हैबिट्स को वो सूट करते हैं ये बीक्स एंड क्लॉज. वी हैव वन मोर एग्जांपल, द लॉन्ग नेक ऑफ जिराफ. द लॉन्ग नेक ऑफ जिराफ, इट इज वन मोर एग्जांपल ऑफ द लॉन्ग टर्म adaptations. As we can see, we had different types of birds who have got different types of claws and beaks suiting their feeding. Some may feed on grains, some may feed on flesh, isn't it? So they have different types of beaks and different types of claws which suit their perching habits and which suit their feeding habits. And the second example of the long-term adaptations is the long neck of giraffe, and we see this adaptation, this long neck has been developed over a very long period of time, and these traits, this adaptation, these changes, they get inherited, they get passed on from one generation to another generations. Now, dear students, let's take up another topic, that is the adaptation to temperature. Now, in today's lecture, we will be discussing only about the plants. So our next topic is adaptation to temperature. Adaptation to temperature. Adaptation to temperature. और इसमें हम सिर्फ प्लांट्स के बारे में डिस्कस करेंगे. And the animals we will be taking up in the next lecture. So what are the different types of adaptations? What are the different types of changes which the plants have developed over a very long period of time so as to adjust themselves, so as to adapt themselves in very harsh environmental conditions? So our next topic is adaptations to temperature. Now, dear students, in a response to the temperature, in response to the extreme temperatures, plants produces various types of proteins. So we can say, in a response to in response to extreme temperatures, plants they have developed various types of proteins. They have developed various types of proteins. और ये जो प्रोटीन्स क्या करते हैं? These proteins provide them protection. We are studying adaptation to temperature with respect to plants or with reference to plants. Now we say, in response to the changing temperatures और इन रेस्पॉन्स टू द एक्सट्रीम टेम्परेचर, चाहे वो बहुत कम टेम्परेचर हो, सब जीरो टेम्परेचर हो, या बहुत ज्यादा टेम्परेचर हो, वेरी हाई टेम्परेचर एंड वेरी लो टेम्परेचर्स. सो वी कॉल देम एक्सट्रीम टेम्परेचर्स, इजंट इट, वेरी हाई एंड वेरी लो. उसके रेस्पॉन्स में प्लांट्स हैव गॉट वेरियस प्रोटीन्स, प्लांट्स हैव गॉट वेरियस प्रोटीन्स, और वो प्रोटीन्स प्लांट्स को प्रोटेक्ट करते हैं. और किससे प्रोटेक्ट करते हैं? पहला, द डैमेजिंग इफेक्ट्स ऑफ किससे? आइस फॉर्मेशन. द डैमेजिंग इफेक्ट्स ऑफ आइस फॉर्मेशन. और जब आइस फॉर्मेशन होती है तो उससे क्या होगा? उससे ये होता है, ये जो एंजाइम्स की एफिशिएंसी होती है प्लांट्स में, वो रिड्यूस हो जाती है. तो डैमेजिंग इफेक्ट्स ऑफ आइस फॉर्मेशन which results in reducing the efficiency of enzymes. It reduces the efficiency of enzymes. It reduces the efficiency of enzymes. I repeat, adaptation to temperatures with respect to plants. हमने ये कहा कि एक्सट्रीम टेम्परेचर्स के रिस्पॉन्स में प्लांट्स ने डेवलप किए हैं ओवर ए लॉन्ग पीरियड ऑफ टाइम सर्टेन प्रोटीन्स. वो प्रोटीन्स क्या करते हैं? प्रोटीन्स इनको प्रोटेक्ट करते हैं अगेंस्ट द डैमेजिंग इफेक्ट्स ऑफ आइस फॉर्मेशन. आइस फॉर्मेशन तभी होगा जब सब जीरो टेम्परेचर होगा, बहुत कम टेम्परेचर होगा. और उससे क्या होगा? अगर आइस फॉर्मेशन होगी तो उसकी वजह से एंजाइम्स की जो एफिशिएंसी है दैट गेट्स रिड्यूस्ड. अब वो कौन से प्रोटीन्स है जो प्लांट्स को प्रोटेक्ट करते हैं फ्रॉम द डैमेजिंग इफेक्ट ऑफ आइस फॉर्मेशन? ठीक है, एंजाइम्स की एफिशिएंसी कम ना हो, कैसे वो प्रोटेक्ट करते हैं, इससे कैसे वो अपने आप को बचाते हैं? नाउ दे हैव गॉट एंटीफ्रीज प्रोटीन्स. वी कॉल देम एंटीफ्रीज प्रोटीन्स. सो वी राइट एंटीफ्रीज प्रोटीन्स. Antifreeze proteins. In response to the sub-zero temperatures, which reduces the efficiency of enzymes in the plants, plants have got the antifreeze proteins, and these antifreeze proteins prevent the formation of intracellular and extracellular ice crystals. Intracellular and extracellular ice crystals. So we say plants have got certain proteins protect them from extreme temperatures. अगर हम बहुत कम टेम्परेचर की बात करें, they have got antifreeze proteins, and these antifreeze proteins they prevent the plants from the formation of intracellular as well as extracellular ice crystals. तो ये तो हुआ सब जीरो टेम्परेचर्स की अगर हम बात करें. अब अगर टेम्परेचर बहुत ज्यादा हुआ, isn't it, वेरी हाई टेम्परेचर्स, तो उस सूरत में क्या है? उस सूरत में क्या होगा? Now if we have the very high temperatures, the second condition is very high temperatures. These are all the changes, useful changes. इन्हीं changes की वजह से the plants have survived all these tough environmental conditions. So अगर बहुत ज्यादा टेम्परेचर हुआ, वेरी हाई टेम्परेचर, तो वहां उससे क्या होगा? उस हाई टेम्परेचर से देयर आर वेरी हाई चांसेस ऑफ एंजाइम डिनेचुरेशन. एंजाइम डिनेचुरेशन होने का खतरा होता है. एंजाइम डिनेचुरेशन, इससे एंजाइम्स डिनेचर हो जाते हैं बिकॉज ऑफ वेरी हाई टेम्परेचर्स. अब प्लांट्स में क्या हुआ है? प्लांट्स हैव डेवलप्ड द हीट शॉक प्रोटीन्स. Plants have developed the heat shock proteins. तो सब जीरो टेम्परेचर्स के लिए हमारे पास थे शाबाश, antifreeze proteins, and for very high temperatures we have heat shock proteins in plants. और ये जो heat shock proteins होते हैं, they prevent the aggregation of proteins, prevent the aggregation of proteins into inactive complexes, अब ये हीट शॉक प्रोटीन्स क्या करते हैं, दे प्रिवेंट द एग्रीगेशन ऑफ प्रोटीन्स, और जब एग्रीगेशन होगा ये इनको प्रिवेंट करता है ये इनएक्टिव कॉम्प्लेक्सेस में कन्वर्ट ना हो जाए, और विद द रिजल्ट इट प्रिवेंट्स देयर डिग्रेडेशन. So these were the two examples for temperature, for extreme temperatures. For sub-zero temperatures we have the antifreeze proteins, and for extreme temperatures, very high temperatures, we have the heat shock proteins. And the antifreeze proteins, what do? They prevent the formation of ice crystals, and these heat shock proteins, they prevent the conversion of these proteins into inactive complexes, and thereby preventing the plants from their degradation. इसके अलावा अगर हम और एक चीज देखें, plants escape the overheating, the extreme temperatures in the ambient environment, the extreme temperatures in the immediate environment by way of transpiration. This is one more adaptation, by way of transpiration. ठीक है? What's transpiration? It is the loss of water vapor through the stomatal openings. इतना ही नहीं, now there are certain plants which reduce the absorption of light. Certain plants which reduce the absorption of light. कैसे ये लाइट एब्जॉर्प्शन को रिड्यूस करते हैं? क्योंकि उनके जो लीव्स होते हैं, they have hairs on their leaves, जिनको हम ट्राइकोफिलस लीव्स बोलते हैं, and they have scales. Because of the presence of scales and because of the presence of leaf hairs, they reduce the absorption of light. इतना ही नहीं, अगर हम डेजर्ट प्लांट्स की बात करें, जिनको हम जीरोफाइट्स भी बोलते हैं, तो उनमें दे हैव संकन स्टोमेटा. इनके जो स्टोमेटा होते हैं, इट इज अ वेरी गुड एग्जांपल of adaptation in desert plants. In xerophytes they have sunken stomata, that means their stomata are found in small pits, और जिससे कि इनकी transpiration rate जो होती है वो कम हो जाती है, and they can preserve the water. अगर मैं और एक example दूं आपको adaptations in response to high temperatures in plants, तो there are certain grasses or there are some grasses जहां पे rolling of leaves होता है. There is rolling of leaf blades in response to very high temperature. जब दिन में बहुत शिद्दत की गर्मी होती है, तो ये इन प्लांट्स में क्या होता है, their leaves roll, and the rolling of the leaves takes place with the help of certain specialized cells, और उन cells को हम बोलते हैं bulliform cells और motor cells. Bulliform or motor cells. Now we have certain xerophytes, the plants which are found in deserts or desert-like conditions or very dry conditions. Now these plants have developed certain adaptations, morphological adaptations. Based on those adaptations, we classify these xerophytes into different categories. The first category is the microphyllous plants. जैसे नाम से ही पता चलता है, what are these microphyllous plants? Now these microphyllous plants, they have small and reduced leaves. These microphyllous plants, they have small and reduced leaves. तो इनकी जो अगर मैं आपको एग्जाम्पल लिखूं, the example that is asparagus. Now the second type of plant is sclerophyllus. Sclerophyllus. What are these sclerophyllus plants? These sclerophyllus plants, they have leathery thick leaves. They have leathery thick leaves. These are all adaptations. Leathery thick leaves. Leathery thick leaves. और इसकी जो example है, इनकी जो example है, the very good example of these sclerophyllus plants is Nerium. 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 Now we have one more type of plant. It is known as Trichophilus. 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 नाम से ही पता चलता है tricho. Tricho, it stands for hair. That means the trichophilus plants, they have got their leaves covered with a hairy covering. That means they have got the hairs on their leaves, isn't it? So trichophilus, leaves with hairy covering. तो इनमें leaves जो होते हैं, leaves with hairy covering. ठीक है, इसकी जो एग्जाम्पल मैं अगर आपको बोलूं, द एग्जाम्पल दैट इज कैलोट्रोपिस. Calotropis. Now we have one more type of these xerophytic plants, one more type, that is known as Malacophilus. Malacophilus. We have Malacophilus. Malacophilus. We have Malacophilus. So we had microphilous plants, sclerophyllus plants, trichophilous plants, and malacophilus plants. Now what are these malacophilus plants? They have thick and fleshy leaves. They have thick and fleshy. They have thick and fleshy leaves. और इनकी जो best example है, that is aloe. Aloe हम अपने घरों में भी pots में लगाते हैं, isn't it? So we have aloe. Aloe vera is one of the species of aloe. We have aloe. We have one more example, that is open shade भी इसकी एक example है. So these are all adaptations. These are all adaptations which have been developed in these xerophytes. And on the basis of these changes, on the basis of these adaptations, we have classified these xerophytes into these four groups. That is Malacophilus, the plants with thick and fleshy leaves. Example aloe. Microphilus, small and reduced leaves. Asparagus इसकी example है. Sclerophyllus, leathery thick leaves. इसकी जो example है, that is Nerium. Trichophilus, the plants who have which have got the leaves with hairy covering. और इसकी जो example है, that is Calotropis. Now in certain areas जहाँ पे snowfall बहुत ज़्यादा होता है, especially अगर हम अपनी कश्मीर वैली की भी बात करें, बहुत ज़्यादा बर्फ़ होती है winters में, तो आपने देखा होगा जो हमारे हाई ऑल्टीट्यूड एरियाज है वहाँ पे पाइन्स होते हैं, कॉनिफर्स होते हैं, उनके जो लीव्स होते हैं, they have got these needle-like leaves, isn't it? They have got these needle-like leaves. So these needle-like leaves are also an adaptation. How? They prevent the accumulation of snow on these leaves. So ये जो pointed needle-like leaves होते हैं, pointed leaves होते हैं, acicular leaves होते हैं, they prevent the accumulation of snow on these leaves. So it is one of the adaptations. ये जो इनकी जो morphological adaptation है, needle-like leaves, pointed leaves, which prevent the accumulation of snow on these leaves. So आज के lecture में dear students, what did we discuss? We discussed about the adaptations. We discussed about adaptations. We discussed about the types of adaptations. We discussed about the need of adaptations. और हमने आज के इस अपने lecture में discuss किया the adaptations to temperature with respect to plants. Now dear students, this was all for today's lecture. In case you have any query or if you want to seek the clarification of your doubts, you can contact me. My phone number is, I will write my phone number on the board. I will write my phone number on the board. My phone number is 94 9419077123. You can WhatsApp me on the same number 9419077123. You can WhatsApp me, or you can contact me on my email ID. My email is alf.hsn, which stands for Altaf Hussain, env.sc@gmail.com. You can contact me via my email, or you can WhatsApp me on my number for clearing your doubts, or if you want to know more about the adaptations. So dear students, this was all for today's lecture. We'll be meeting in another lecture with yet another topic. Until then, take care.